There is a story from the Cold War that sounds so extraordinary, so audacious, so completely impossible that most people assume it must be fiction. It is not. Somewhere beneath the freezing waters of the Sea of Okhotsk, deep inside Soviet territorial waters, in complete darkness at nearly 400 feet below the surface, American Navy divers were crawling along the ocean floor searching for a cable, not a military target, not a weapon system, a telephone cable, a thin 5-inch wire carrying the most sensitive military communications of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, running between a top-secret nuclear submarine base and military headquarters in Vladivostok. And when they found it, they did something that the Soviets considered completely impossible. They attached a listening device to it. For nearly a decade, the United States Navy sat at the bottom of the Soviet Ocean and listened to everything. Submarine movements, ballistic missile development plans, nuclear strike capabilities, personal phone calls between Soviet officers and their families. All of it flowing through that cable, completely unencrypted, because the Soviets never imagined for a single moment that anyone could reach it. This is the story of Operation Ivy Bells, the most audacious underwater espionage operation in the history of the Cold War. And it worked perfectly for almost 10 years, until one desperate man made one phone call that destroyed everything. To understand how Operation Ivy Bells came to be, you need to understand the world of 1971. The Cold War had been running for over 2 decades, and both the United States and the Soviet Union had built enormous intelligence-gathering operations aimed at each other. Satellites photographed military installations. Agents infiltrated government offices. Communications were intercepted and decoded. But the Soviet Navy had what they believed was an unbreakable advantage. Their most sensitive military communications between the Pacific Fleet headquarters in Vladivostok and the nuclear submarine base at Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula traveled through an undersea cable at the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk. The Sea of Okhotsk was Soviet territorial water, constantly patrolled by Soviet warships and monitored by underwater detection devices. No foreign vessel had any business being there. No foreign diver could survive the conditions at that depth. And even if someone somehow managed to reach the cable, the Soviets were confident that their communications were safe because the cable ran along the ocean floor hundreds of feet below the surface in waters that no Western submarine could navigate undetected. The cable was, as far as Soviet military planners were concerned, completely untouchable. They were wrong. The man who realized the cable could be found and tapped was a United States Navy captain named James Bradley. Bradley had a simple but brilliant insight that came not from intelligence reports or classified briefings, but from a childhood memory. Growing up near the Mississippi River, he remembered seeing signs posted along the riverbanks warning boats not to drop anchor near underwater cables. He reasoned that if the Soviets had laid a communication cable along the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk, they would have posted similar warning signs along the Siberian coastline to prevent their own fishing vessels and ships from accidentally damaging it. It was an elegant and beautifully simple piece of reasoning, and it was completely correct. Bradley pitched the idea to the combined leadership of the CIA, the United States Navy, and the National Security Agency. The risk was enormous. Sending an American submarine into Soviet territorial waters was an act that, if discovered, could have triggered a serious international incident or worse. But the potential intelligence reward was so extraordinary that the agencies agreed immediately. In 1972, the USS Halibut, a specially modified submarine equipped with a deep-sea diving chamber and advanced underwater equipment, was dispatched to the Sea of Okhotsk to find the cable. The Halibut navigated carefully into Soviet waters and began searching the coastline for the warning signs Bradley had predicted. They found them exactly where he expected, posted along the northern Siberian coast warning vessels away from the cable route below. The submarine followed the signs and located the cable on the ocean floor. Then came the most dangerous part. Specially trained saturation divers, equipped with heavily modified rebreather equipment that allowed them to operate at extreme depth without producing the telltale bubbles that would reveal their presence, left the submarine's diving chamber and descended nearly 400 feet to the ocean floor. They worked in complete darkness, in freezing water, inside Soviet territorial waters, with Soviet patrol vessels operating somewhere above them on the surface. They found the cable. It was 5 inches in diameter, running along the mud of the ocean floor. They attached a 20-foot-long listening and recording device to the outside of the cable without piercing its casing. The device was designed so that if the Soviets ever raised the cable for maintenance, the listening device would automatically detach and fall to the ocean floor, leaving no trace. Every month, Navy divers returned to retrieve the recorded tapes and replace them with fresh ones. The operation was so meticulously planned and so perfectly executed that the Soviets had absolutely no idea it was happening. What the NSA analysts found when they played those tapes back in Washington was almost beyond belief. The Soviets, completely confident in the physical security of their undersea cable, had transmitted a staggering amount of sensitive military information without any encryption whatsoever. Personal phone calls between Soviet naval officers and their families in Moscow sat alongside discussions of submarine patrol schedules, ballistic missile test results, nuclear warhead deployment plans, and assessments of Soviet naval readiness. The Americans were not breaking codes or piecing together fragments of intercepted transmissions. They were simply listening to the Soviet Navy talk openly, in plain language, about its most closely guarded secrets. As one intelligence analyst later described it, the Soviets were handing their most well-guarded secrets over on a silver platter. For nearly a decade, Operation Ivy Bells produced a continuous and extraordinarily detailed picture of Soviet Pacific Fleet operations, capabilities, and intentions. The intelligence was so valuable that it directly informed American negotiating positions during the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, known as SALT II. From the Okhotsk recordings, American officials learned something that fundamentally changed their understanding of the Cold War. The Soviets were just as afraid of nuclear war as the Americans were. That knowledge, drawn directly from unguarded conversations on a tapped cable at the bottom of the ocean, helped make the SALT II agreement possible. After the Halibut was decommissioned, the operations were continued by the USS Seawolf and later the USS Parche. The Parche, whose specific missions remain largely classified to this day, received 9 Presidential Unit citations, 10 Navy Unit commendations, and 13 Navy Expeditionary Medals during its service life, making it the most decorated submarine in American naval history. And then, in 1981, everything fell apart. American surveillance satellites showed something alarming in the Sea of Okhotsk. A group of Soviet warships, including a salvage vessel, were anchored directly over the location of the tapped cable. The USS Parche was dispatched immediately to retrieve the listening device before the Soviets could examine it. When the divers reached the ocean floor, the device was gone. The Soviets had found it. They had located and removed a piece of equipment that they were not supposed to know existed, from a location they were not supposed to know had been compromised, in waters they considered completely secure for nearly a decade. The Americans had no idea how the Soviets had found out. The investigation that followed was thorough, methodical, and deeply troubling. And the answer, when it finally came 4 years later, was not a sophisticated intelligence breakthrough by the KGB. It was something far more mundane and far more devastating. It was one man with a debt problem and a telephone. His name was Ronald Pelton. He was an analyst at the National Security Agency, with full access to some of the most sensitive intelligence programs in the American government, including Operation Ivy Bells. In 1981, Pelton was in serious financial difficulty. He had filed for bankruptcy and was desperate for money. So he did something almost incomprehensibly reckless. He picked up a telephone and called the Soviet embassy in Washington. He offered to sell them classified information in exchange for cash. The Soviets agreed. Pelton sold the details of Operation Ivy Bells, one of the most successful and sensitive intelligence operations in American history, for $5,000. He later received an additional $30,000 for further consultations. For $35,000, a decade of extraordinary intelligence work, the lives of every diver who had gone to the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk, and one of America's most powerful Cold War advantages were handed directly to the KGB. Pelton's betrayal was not uncovered until 1985, when a KGB defector named Vitaly Yurchenko identified him as the source who had compromised the operation. Pelton was arrested, tried, and convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. The original listening device of the Soviets recovered from the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk is today on display at the KGB Museum in Moscow, a trophy of the one moment when a desperate man's phone call undid everything. But the story of Operation Ivy Bells does not end in failure. The intelligence gathered during nearly a decade of operations had already changed the course of the Cold War in ways that could not be undone. The knowledge that the Soviets feared nuclear war as deeply as the Americans did had contributed directly to arms limitation agreements that reduced the danger of conflict between the two superpowers. The techniques developed for Operation Ivy Bells pioneered an entirely new era of underwater intelligence gathering that continued throughout the remaining years of the Cold War and beyond. And the USS Parche, whose specific achievements remain classified, continued operating for years after Ivy Bells ended, earning decorations that suggest its later missions were every bit as extraordinary as the ones that came before. Operation Ivy Bells was a triumph of American ingenuity, courage, and technological capability. It was undone not by Soviet intelligence or military power, but by one man's weakness. And even then, the damage that one phone call caused could not erase what had already been achieved. At the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk, in the darkness and cold of Soviet territorial waters, American divers had done something the Soviets considered impossible. And for nearly 10 years, they got away with it completely. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more Cold War stories every week.